all so much. I'm just thrilled to be part of this HerTorah, and really delighted to be with all of you amazing women tonight. And so what I want to do tonight is, you'll notice that there is a source sheet. We're not going to be looking at that inside. And when I say inside, what I'm saying there is we're not going to be reading the text word by word. I'm going to summarize one of the sources, but I wanted you all to have it for your own library, for your own edification, because what I want to do with us tonight is really have an interactive discussion. And so I'm going to frame that with one of my favorite sources from the Babylonian Talmud. And before I do that, I just kind of want to explain what the Babylonian Talmud is. And the Babylonian Talmud is this amazing, I guess you could call it like a corpus or a collection of Jewish law and story and just like everything. And it was compiled in Iraq, which was then known as Babel, about 1,500 years ago. And the Babylonian Talmud is divided into different sections, and each section is called a tractate. And each tractate has a multiple chapters, and usually each tractate is topical, but often what happens in the Talmud is that even if there is a topic for a particular section, there are a lot of tangents. Someone once, I don't remember who told me this, but somebody once quipped to me that the Talmud is lecture notes for a lecture you did not attend. So we often are dropping into rabbinic conversations without a lot of context. And the reason I mention that to begin with is because the source that I'm going to be describing tonight comes from a tractate called Ta'anit. Ta'anit literally comes from the Hebrew word for fasts. And most of this tractate has to do with fasting because of a lack of rain. Because of course, in the land of Israel, you really need rain for sustenance and livelihood. So the rabbis would ask, well, what happens if it doesn't rain? When do we declare a public fast? And so most of this tractate is about that. But there is the third chapter of the tractate of Ta'anit is really an interesting chapter that has a lot of different stories in it that have to do with behavior and how we are in relationship with other people. And something that I'm very interested in, both as an educator, but also just as a Jew with a disability and as a human being, is the emphasis that we place in our tradition on human dignity, on Kevod, Habriyot. Kevod, Habriyot gets translated in English as human dignity, but it actually could also be understood as the weightiness of creatures, meaning that we must really make sure that people's dignity is deeply respected. And many of us with disabilities, unfortunately, had an experience this morning, have experiences that are very lacking in dignity, whether it's inside the Jewish community, whether it's outside. And when I'm reminded of the Torah's imperative to treat everyone with dignity, because it says in the first chapter of Genesis, that we're all created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God, it's really just such an important reminder. And we see that in a variety of places also in the Talmud. And that's where I'm going to start talking about this particular passage. And I apologize in advance. I'm going to be doing what I call an outside summary, which means that we're not going to be looking directly at the text because I want to make sure we have time to talk. So I'm going to summarize this text as quickly as I can. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the themes. Folks may be familiar. If you're not familiar, don't worry about it at all. And we'll talk a little bit about it. And then later on in the Q&A, if folks have other questions, or you can talk to me offline. But anyway, in Tractate Ta'anit, on page 20A and B, so each page of Talmud is double-sided, there's a story about a very famous rabbi named named Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon. And what's really important here is that he is portrayed in the story as a rabbi who's been learning Torah all day, and he's driving home, or he's riding home on his donkey, and he's thinking to himself, I'm fantastic. Basically, I'm awesome. I've learned all this Torah, holding his head high, really proud of himself, kind of riding along. You can kind of imagine the scene, right? Like riding down the road, getting ready to go home after a good day of learning. And he's on the road and he encounters a man, And we don't know from the text what kind of disability or impairments this man had. But we do know that there was something about this man that was really unattractive to Rabbi Elazar. And so Rabbi Elazar, the man greets him and says, "Greetings, my rabbi." Now, we're not also sure how the man knew that Elazar was a rabbi. Also, something to name, this man does not have a name. So I think that's really important in this story, to remember that this man does not actually get a name. He's known as Reka, empty, which we'll talk a little bit more about that. And Elazar says back to him, "Ugh, are all the people of the city that you come from as ugly as you are?" And so of course we're thinking, wow, that's horrible. He didn't greet the man, he's called him ugly. And the man says, if that's your attitude towards me, effectively, then you really better go talk to the craftsman with a capital C, right? Meaning Hashem, God. You really better go talk to the craftsman who created me and say to him, how ugly is the vessel you made? Right? So we're going right back to that line in Bereshit, in Genesis, where we're told we're created b'tselem Elokim, which our tradition understands to mean that we all have inherent value and worth. And of course, we know, but it's, I think, important to say it again, we don't live this in our daily lives nearly to the way that we should. Our tradition calls us to do it, but we know from our own experiences every day, and we know from this text that we don't live that. So Rabbi Elazar realizes that he's insulted this man, ideally, at least that's what we hope, right? There are lots of ways to interpret this text. And he gets off of his donkey and he's prostrating himself and he's begging this guy for forgiveness. And they keep going towards Rabbi Elazar's city. And the man says, well, I'm not going to forgive you until you go and talk to the craftsman who created me. Because of course you've been learning Torah all day, so you claim to have this great relationship with God. You better go talk to that craftsman and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? And what I love about this, when I teach this to disabled folks, what I love about this is that it really resonates. People are like, yeah, I've been bullied that way. I've been insulted in one way or another. This is a real, maybe not exactly the way that this man experienced it, but most people I know who identify as disabled or people with disabilities, we've experienced this kind of thing. And so he's on the road, so the men are still on the road, and they get to Rabbi Elazar's city. And the people of the town come out and say, my rabbi. And the other man says, who are you calling my rabbi, my rabbi? And the townspeople say, well, of course, Rabbi Elazar. And the man says, well, why are you calling Rabbi Elazar my rabbi? He did such and such a thing to me on the road. And the townspeople, and this is a really interesting piece, say, well, can't you please forgive him because he's such a great Torah scholar? So if we pause there for a second and just think, like, can't you just forgive him? He's such a great Torah scholar, right? As if his scholarship somehow means that he is not responsible for his conduct. And so what the man says to him is, well, maybe I'll forgive him for your sake. That's an interesting piece. So long as there are not many like him among the people of Israel. Basically saying, fine, this is again really ambiguous and we can interpret it in so many different ways. I'll forgive him, but there better not be a lot of rabbis like him. And when I've taught this to rabbis, some of the reactions that I've gotten have included one of my favorite lines that I heard recently was, they'd really better pin this to the door of every single rabbinical school. Because, just because you are a teacher of Torah, or just because you are in Jewish leadership, it does not mean that you live the values that Torah really ascribes to. And here we have in this Gemara, in this passage from Talmud, we have this reminder that you have to be a decent and menschlech, a good person. And then it ends with Rabbi Elazar being in his study house. So we imagine in context that this is something that he's telling his students. And it ends with a really interesting and ambiguous line, which also, this is how the story is introduced as well. And it basically says, you need to be soft like a reed and not hard like a cedar. You need to be soft like a reed, flexible. Now, flexible can be a challenging word in the disability community. We can talk about that later. but you need to be able to be responsive and aware of the people around you. Now, again, this is complicated because it raises a lot of questions. And now I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about some of the things that this story raises. I love this text because it is an example, and it's not the only one, but it is an example of a person with what we would call today a disability standing up for themselves and demanding the dignity that they are due. And I can tell you, even as late as this morning, that is very difficult to do often in the moment as a person with a disability. You know, even as somebody who teaches this, even as somebody who really tries to live this out in my own life, I experience ableism all the time. You know, people with disabilities experience ableism all the time. It's unfortunately, it's one of those things, you know, that we don't talk about in our culture nearly to the degree that we should, because we barely recognize and name it. So here we have a man standing up for himself and saying, if you're going to be so crass to me, then go talk to the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made, right? Because he's saying, I am created b'tselem Elokim. I have inherent dignity and worth. I am created in the image of God. I have inherent dignity and value and worth as a person in the world. And if you can't accept that, then you might need to go and have a conversation with the one that you clearly have claimed to be serving all day through your Torah study. And the question also really arises in this text, does Rabbi Elazar learn? Now, something that we should know as background, and I really want to thank my teacher, Rav Tavi Adler, for reminding me of this a while ago when she taught this text, that Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon is the son of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Reish Lakish. And that is really significant. Rashbi, excuse me, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, excuse me, I misspoke there. Elazar ben Shimon is the son of Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and the reason that is very significant, because there is a famous story in the Talmud about a cave in which Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and his son Elazar go for 12 years, and there's a whole story about they bury themselves in sands and they try to keep their garments clean and all of that. But they go and learn Torah for 12 years, and then they emerge from the cave, and they're really disappointed by how the world is working. And God says, well, you got to go back in the cave. They go back in the cave for another 12 years, and the story goes on. But what's important about that text is that in that instance, both Shimon bar Yochai and Elazar ben Shimon are portrayed as very arrogant people. And when we look at this text in relationship to that, Elazar ben Shimon is perhaps not learning from his prior 24 years of experience, you know, being alone in this cave with his father, and then emerging after 12 years and really like treating people with contempt and having to go back in because he wasn't able to be in the world. So there's what to learn about behavior. He's already seen as not the greatest character in the world. And we don't actually know from this text if he actually learns anything or really does tshuva. I would argue that he does not do tshuva. People could understand this differently in lots of different ways, but I would argue that he does not do tshuva because the end of the story is really beautiful, talking about the reed is what's being used for quills for mezuzot and tefillin, for mezuzahs and tefillin. But we don't actually get any indication from Elazar ben Shimon that he's actually understood what this other man is telling him, or even understands his experience of the world. And when I teach this text, when I really dig into this text, it's just such an interesting reminder and experience of the ways in which this man who is so degraded by Elazar ben Shimon is saying to the rabbi, like, you think you have all of this learning, but here you are acting in such an abhorrent way in the street. And this is not okay. And too often we can find ourselves in situations where we think we've got all this stuff going for us, but we're not actually living it out. We talk the talk, we don't walk the walk. And in this era of COVID and moving into a new reality, whatever that is for us, people with disabilities have been so adversely impacted by the pandemic, not only in terms of healthcare outcomes, although of course in terms of healthcare outcomes, but in terms of quality of life, in terms of being able to actually be in the world, particularly folks who are immunocompromised, when people are not obeying public health measures, that makes it even harder. It's even more isolating for people who, like myself, who have visual impairments and blindness. Social distancing while blind is not a fun thing. It's very difficult to do. It means that travel becomes much, much harder. And so many other things that are just really impacted. And often we don't think about that in the community. I know that when the pandemic started, we talked a little bit about increased accessibility of online content, but we didn't really do a good enough job of thinking about the ways in which this would have lasting impact. And so one of the things that we as a Jewish community, I think, are really uniquely able to do is, as we're coming back together, really thinking about that inclusion is not only about accommodations. It's not only about having done something and saying, oh, I did this thing, look at how inclusive. Fundamentally, it's about remembering that every person is a whole person and needs to be treated with the utmost care and dignity. And we do that through how we interact with people and how we care for people and how we build bonds of community. So I hope I haven't taken all my time. I'm going to stop there. And if there's any time for questions or comments, Ariel, if people are writing into the chat, if you could read aloud some of the messages, because I close my chat screen when I'm teaching, so my screen reader doesn't yell at me all the time.
You're amazing. That last note and bite that you left us with about just not using this word accommodation, but remembering the humanity, the deep humanity of everyone, and this sad fact that we need to be reminded of people's humanity. That's what makes me want to cry. And I think, Rabbi Tuchman, myself, I think so many of us we're so self-absorbed during this entire pandemic. The idea of then doing that mental shift to think what the experience is like for someone with a disability, where all of us were trying to jump through hoops. It's mind-blowing to really revisit what our own experiences were and then think about it with the lens of someone through a disability. I'm going to ask some of the questions. Michal was asking, can you share the site for the piece of Talmud that you taught?
Yes, absolutely. It's Ta'anit. It's tractate Ta'anit. So Taanit is how you would transliterate that word. 20A and B.
And Adi is rightfully sharing that there was so much nodding going on as you were speaking. Thank you so much for sharing these words. I'll echo that too. I was wondering, can I ask you to speak a little bit more to, particularly since you touched upon the idea of leadership, or people in positions of leadership or elevated positions in community. I think that you're obviously preaching to the choir, to those in the room. How might you suggest, or how have you in the past thought about offering some suggestions, guidance, insight, holding up a mirror, whatever you want to call it, to those in leadership who have the ability to be communal models and make real impact? Can you share what you might have done or what you might want us to do or something along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ariel, for that question, because it's something that I spent a lot of time when I was a rabbinical student thinking about very seriously. And now that I'm a rabbi, I'm really committed to this as part of my own professional practice. A few things that I really try to do. I think it's extraordinarily important, and I want to be clear that I have no particular preference or bias. I think it's very important for communal leaders, whether they're rabbis or educators or whatever, rabbis, rabbah, rabbinit, any title you choose, to have either a rabbi themselves that they can go to, or some other professional that they can go to basically just make sure that they are on the up and up. It's not because I don't think we are trustworthy people, but it's very important. We often do need that mirror to ourselves. We need to have someone reflecting back at us. Often we have very difficult situations in the profession that we need to really make sure we are working through competently. And another thing that I recommend is to really do some independent work on self-reflection. There's a beautiful practice that I love, which is soul accounting, which we often think about during Elul. But it's actually something that you can do every day, where you just take even 3 minutes a day. It doesn't have to be like a 20-minute activity. You could take like 3 minutes a day and be like, how did my day go? Do I wish I had done something differently today? What was my experience in this arena? How am I struggling with this thing? It's just a way to keep ourselves accountable to ourselves and to others. And I think especially also in this time of COVID and this time of burnout that so many of us are experiencing, to really be honest with ourselves about what our capacities are. Because often what happens, and this is sort of like a formula that I use, it might seem a little simple, but I think it's actually quite profound. When stress increases, accessibility and bad behavior, when stress increases, accessibility and bad behavior, inaccessibility and bad behavior increase. I'll say that again. With increased stress comes increased inaccessibility and bad behavior, because we are often at the end of our rope and we just do not have the bandwidth. But we need to really check in with ourselves and also be honest about what our strengths are. And just, unfortunately, how many leaders have we experienced who are just nothing but self-absorbed egotists, right? And it's in every community. And so we need to be very aware of that.
You get snapped from me on that one. Rabbi Tuchman, thank you for that. And I have another question from Shari. Can you give some examples of what it means to go from inclusion as accommodation to inclusion as creating a welcome space for each person?
Yeah, and it really boils down to humanity, number one thing. I mean, it's actually like number one, number two, number three, number four, number five. And on a very practical level, one of the suggestions that I give to people in synagogue context and in Jewish communal context a lot is to have an access coordinator and make sure that that person is not a volunteer. And the reason that I emphasize that is because often what happens is that when accessibility falls under the rubric of a volunteer portfolio, and this is not to diminish in any way the amazing work of our volunteers, but when accessibility falls under that portfolio, it can often, even unintentionally, be the last thing on the agenda. When you have someone who's on staff who is holding that portfolio, you know that that is being covered in one way or another. And of course, there's always room for improvement, but we know that there's someone to go to. Having it stated on your materials, this community welcomes those with disabilities. If you have accessibility requests or needs, please contact such and such. There are lots of people who have disabilities who do not self-disclose for so many reasons. I am someone for whom disclosure is automatic, but there are those for whom it is not. And in that case, having a system when we're able to be in person again, having a system where people maybe have a rotation of like being greeters and just doing a basic kindness of going up and saying, hello, Shabbat Shalom, or good day, or whatever day of the week it is. We're so glad you're here. And like the way that we've done that tonight at SVIVAH, just with that reminder of, we're so glad you're here. Sounds like such a small thing, but it goes a long way. Because often people just want to be in the community like everyone else and don't want to feel like a project or a last resort. And so that I would say those are examples of really going from accommodation to inclusion, is remembering that people are people and they come with all kinds of needs and desires and interests, and really helping folks feel part of the fabric of community by just extending a hand of kindness and when we can do that again. Obviously, we're not really able to do that as much now, but you know what I'm saying? Like, have that sense of, kindness and warmth and compassion is so important, and even more now after the pandemic. I mean, I feel like, truthfully, we are in such a new world that I almost have to relearn everything I've been teaching on this topic, because so much is different
now. Wow, thank you for that. I'm gonna close the breakout room, but before I do, I'm gonna ask one of the last questions that we've got. So Rabbi, can you answer it while the rest of the folk are coming back into the room?
Yes, absolutely.
So the last question was from Katie. COVID has highlighted new types of vulnerability, especially in meeting the needs of those who are immunocompromised. Could you please share any lessons from the disability community regarding how communities can rise to the occasion to meet new needs emerging in an inclusive manner?
I love that question. And I would say the biggest lesson from the disability community is out of the box thinking and innovative thinking. We always have had to do that because the world is so not designed for disability that we're constantly having to figure out ways to get through the world as it is, as we dream for the world as it should be. And so I really encourage communities to be thinking outside of the box in ways that we've been doing so beautifully in so many ways during this pandemic, but even continuing in person, particularly for folks who are immunocompromised and may not feel comfortable being back in person. Really just having a lot of sensitivity about, figuring out ways to make spaces as accessible as we can, figuring out ways to have reasonable accommodations to different activities that really take into account the humanity and the pain that folks are in, the psychological pain, the emotional pain, the spiritual pain, the physical pain that folks have been in during this pandemic. And a lot of this just really boils down to a desire to be thinking outside of the box. And I know that sounds really abstract, but even just saying, asking folks, what do you need? And really just being able to respond to those needs, one thing at a time, even and especially if it feels different. And I know I'm struggling with this myself. We're all learning how to think differently. We're all learning how to show up differently. And so that way of thinking and problem solving is a skill set that I have as a disabled person that I would never want to give up. And I hope that other people, whether you identify as disabled or not, really can learn from that to just make such a better world.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Tuchman. I'm begging you to stick around because I'm sure